15 years ago, Calvin Reed was just a poor, black single dad struggling to raise his own son when tragedy left 3 orphaned children with nowhere else to turn. He had no money, no influence, and barely enough to keep food on the table, yet he chose compassion over comfort and gave them a home. The values he quietly taught in a small garage would eventually inspire a company worth billions, though no one, including the children he raised, knew the sacrifice he had buried inside an old blue lunchbox. When they returned to their hometown as billionaire founders, determined to honor the father who had shaped their lives, a long-hidden secret came to light, changing everything they believed about their past and proving that the greatest legacy is never measured by wealth, but by the lives we choose to lift. By 8 that morning, half of Millstone had gathered outside Depot 17. The old maintenance yard stood beneath a pale winter sky, its brick walls dark with exhaust and rain. A white auction banner stretched across the fence. Reporters crowded beside city officials while neighborhood families watched the place prepare to be sold. Calvin Reed stayed near the service bay doors. His faded work jacket had been patched twice, and grease darkened his hands. At 61, he still opened a classroom inside the depot before sunrise, though the city had ordered him out by noon. A councilman glanced at his worn boots. He still thinks this place belongs to him. Calvin heard him and said nothing. Then a low electric hum rolled down Foundry Avenue. 3 silver buses entered the yard almost silently, each marked North Star Transit Systems. Everyone knew North Star. Its safety technology operated across the country, and its 3 founders had become billionaires before turning 35. No one expected them at the auction. No one expected the buses to stop in front of Calvin. Tiana Cole stepped down first, followed by Malcolm and Jade. Reporters shouted their names. The mayor hurried forward with an outstretched hand. They walked past him. Their eyes stayed fixed on the quiet black man beneath the rusted number 17. Jade covered her mouth. Malcolm stopped behind her. Tiana walked closer, then removed a dented blue metal lunchbox from her case. Its paint had faded, and one corner was crushed inward. Calvin recognized it before she set it on an old service truck. "Dad," Tiana said softly, though every microphone caught the word. "We found what you hid inside it 15 years ago." A murmur moved through the yard. Calvin stared at the lunchbox. Where did you get that?" "Under the lining," Malcolm said. Tiana rested her hand on the lid. "The agreement. The maintenance notes. Route 46. Calvin's breath caught. The mayor's smile disappeared. An older man beside the auction table stepped backward. "You let the whole town believe you failed us," Tiana said. Calvin finally met her eyes. "No," he answered. "I was trying to keep what happened from destroying you twice." The auction clock reached 8:30. 3 billionaires stood before Calvin, calling him Dad. Yet he looked like a man watching a locked door begin to open, and the secret inside that blue lunchbox began with the day 3 children lost everything. 15 years earlier, Depot 17 sounded very different. Diesel engines rattled through the bays before sunrise. Wrenches struck concrete. Air compressors hissed in steady bursts, while the smell of oil drifted through the building like a second skin. Calvin Reed had already been there for 2 hours, kneeling beside an aging city bus with one hand resting against the steel frame. He closed his eyes. Most mechanics watched gauges. Calvin listened. He tapped the suspension once with a rubber mallet, then leaned closer to the front axle. "There you are," he whispered. A younger mechanic laughed from the next bay. "You hear ghosts in those buses, Calvin?" Calvin smiled without looking up. No, just people who'll be stranded if nobody listens. The younger man shrugged and walked away. That was how most people saw him. A hard-working mechanic. A decent man. Nothing more. When his shift ended, Calvin didn't drive home immediately. He crossed the maintenance yard carrying an old blue lunchbox with a dented corner. Inside were 2 turkey sandwiches, an apple cut into neat slices, and a folded note written in black marker. Nobody gets left at the stop. 8-year-old Eli spotted him through the break room window and ran into his father's arms. You fixed them all? Almost. You always say almost. Calvin grinned. Because machines don't believe in perfect. Eli laughed as they shared breakfast on an overturned toolbox while the morning crews clocked in. Life hadn't become easier since Melissa died 2 years earlier. The tiny duplex near the railroad tracks leaked whenever it rained. Medical bills still arrived every month, long after the hospital room had been emptied. Some weeks Calvin picked up overnight repair jobs just to keep the lights on. He never complained where Eli could hear. Every Wednesday evening, though, there was one thing neither of them missed: dinner with the Cole family. Raymond Cole parked his yellow route bus outside the duplex just after 6, honking twice before stepping out with grocery bags balanced on both arms. "If you're making me carry dessert again," Calvin called from the porch, "I'm charging rent." "You'd still owe me from last Thanksgiving." Their laughter echoed down the block. Inside the Cole house, 13-year-old Tiana was already setting plates around the table with careful precision. Malcolm sat on the living room floor, taking apart a broken alarm clock, despite repeated instructions not to. 9-year-old Jade hummed softly while coloring a picture of a city bus with flowers painted across its windows. The children moved through one another's lives as naturally as siblings. Eli challenged Malcolm to finish rebuilding the clock before dinner. Tiana rolled her eyes. "He'll forget to eat." "I heard that," Malcolm answered without looking up. "You were supposed to." Jade quietly slid an extra cookie onto Eli's plate when she thought no one was watching. Calvin noticed. He noticed everything. After dinner, the adults washed dishes while the children played in the backyard beneath fading orange light. Raymond dried a plate and glanced toward the driveway. "My bus has been making a strange vibration." Calvin stopped scrubbing. "What kind?" "Starts around 40 miles an hour, comes and goes." Calvin's expression changed almost imperceptibly. "Tomorrow morning," he said. "Bring it by Bay 4 before your route." Raymond nodded. "If anyone can hear what everyone else misses, it's you." Calvin looked through the kitchen window toward the children laughing together. "I hope this time I'm hearing nothing." But deep inside, a quiet uneasiness settled over him. The next morning, Route 46 rolled into Depot 17. Within seconds of laying his hand against the front wheel assembly, Calvin heard the sound that would change every life around that dinner table forever. It wasn't loud. Most people would have missed it completely. A faint metallic pulse echoed through the brake regulator every few seconds, almost disappearing beneath the rumble of the diesel engine. Calvin asked Raymond to shut the bus down. The yard suddenly became quiet. He knelt beside the front axle again, pressing 2 fingers against the housing while Malcolm's rebuilt alarm clock ticked in his memory. Small signals. Everything warned you before it failed. If you knew how to listen. Raymond watched him with growing concern. "Bad?" Calvin didn't answer immediately. Instead, he crawled beneath the bus carrying a flashlight and stayed there nearly 15 minutes. When he emerged, his face had lost every trace of its usual calm. "This bus shouldn't leave today." Raymond frowned. "That's serious?" The pressure regulator is vibrating unevenly. If it locks under heavy braking, he stopped before finishing the sentence. Raymond knew enough. You think the brakes could fail. I think they deserve a full inspection before you carry 40 people across this city. Without another word, Calvin filled out a maintenance withdrawal request and carried it upstairs to the operations office. Gerald Pike barely glanced at the paperwork. We're already short 3 buses. This one's unsafe. Pike sighed and leaned back in his chair. You've got numbers. I've got 24 years of hearing machines before they break. I asked if you've got numbers. Calvin remained standing. I don't need a computer to tell me something's wrong. Pike slid the form back across the desk. The diagnostic system cleared it yesterday. The diagnostic system isn't riding that hill with passengers. The request is denied. Calvin didn't move. If that regulator fails going downhill, it probably won't. Probably isn't how safety works. Pike's voice hardened. You know what your problem is, Reed? Calvin stayed silent. You trust your instincts more than company procedures. My instincts have kept people alive, and procedures keep this city running. Pike stamped the request. Denied. You've made your recommendation. That's enough. Calvin picked up the rejected form without another word. As he walked back across the yard, every instinct told him to pull the bus out of service himself, but he couldn't. Only operations had that authority. Raymond climbed into the driver's seat a few minutes later. He rolled down the window. You still don't like it? No. Raymond smiled gently. I've trusted your ears for 20 years, so don't drive it. Raymond looked toward the growing line of passengers already gathering at the terminal across the street. If I refuse the route, someone else takes the wheel. Calvin had no answer. The 2 friends simply looked at one another. Finally, Raymond reached out the window. Calvin shook his hand. Come by for dinner tonight, Raymond said. Linda's making chili. I'll bring dessert. You always do. Route 46 pulled away from Depot 17. Calvin stood in the yard much longer than usual, listening until the engine disappeared into the morning traffic. Rain arrived just before sunset. A cold storm swept across Millstone, covering the streets in silver reflections beneath the streetlights. Calvin was closing the garage where he repaired lawnmowers after work when his phone rang. He saw Marissa Grant's name from the county social services office. Instead, it was Eli's school principal. Mr. Reed, there's been an accident involving one of the city buses. Calvin's stomach tightened. He turned on the radio inside his truck. Route 46 involved in a major emergency response. His hands froze on the steering wheel. Before he could start the engine, another call came through. This time it was Depot 17. No one needed to say Raymond's name. Calvin already knew. By the time he reached Millstone General Hospital, rain had soaked through his jacket. Ambulances lined the emergency entrance, their flashing lights reflecting across the wet pavement like broken pieces of glass. Inside, exhausted passengers sat wrapped in blankets while nurses moved quietly between families. Calvin searched every face. Then he saw Marissa Grant. The county social worker wasn't supposed to be there. She stood near the children's waiting room, holding a thin folder against her chest. When she met Calvin's eyes, she didn't have to speak. He closed his own. They're gone? He whispered. Marissa nodded. Raymond and Linda. For several seconds, the sounds around him disappeared. No voices, no footsteps, only silence. Then another sound reached him. Soft crying. Three children sat together in the corner of the waiting room. Tiana stared blankly at the floor, refusing to let anyone touch her. Malcolm held Jade's hand so tightly his knuckles had turned white. Jade buried her face against her brother's shoulder, trembling each time the hospital doors opened. Eli was already sitting beside them. Without saying a word, he had quietly given Jade the cookie his father had packed that morning. Calvin walked over slowly. He knelt in front of the children. "I'm here." That was all he could manage. Jade suddenly threw her arms around his neck. "Please don't let them separate us." The words hit him harder than anything else that day. Marissa waited until the children had fallen asleep before asking Calvin to step into the hallway. "There aren't many options." "What do you mean?" She opened the folder. "No licensed foster family currently has room for 3 siblings together." Calvin looked back through the window. "They'll split them up." She lowered her eyes. "Most likely." Tiana to one home, Malcolm somewhere else, Jade somewhere else. Different schools, different neighborhoods, different lives. Calvin rubbed both hands across his face. There has to be another way. There is one. Marissa hesitated. "You." He stared at her. "You already have Eli." "I know." "You work nights." "I know." "You live in a 2-bedroom duplex." "I know." "And financially..." She didn't finish. She didn't have to. Medical debt still followed him every month. His savings barely covered groceries. Some weeks he repaired lawnmowers until midnight, just to keep the electricity on. Marissa spoke gently. "It would only be temporary until permanent placements are found." Temporary. Calvin looked through the glass once more. Jade had fallen asleep leaning against Malcolm. Tiana remained awake. She wasn't crying anymore. She simply watched every adult who walked past, as though trying to guess which one would decide the rest of her life. Calvin remembered another promise. Nobody gets left at the stop. When he drove home near dawn, the rain had finally stopped. The little duplex looked even smaller than he remembered. 2 bedrooms, 1 bathroom, 1 worn-out couch, 1 kitchen table with 4 chairs. It had barely been enough for 2 people. Now Marissa stood on the porch beside him. "You don't have to answer today." Before Calvin could speak, the front door opened. 8-year-old Eli walked outside carrying his pillow. He looked at the social worker, then at the 3 exhausted children standing silently beside Calvin. Finally, he placed his pillow on the living room floor. "They can have my room." Calvin blinked. "Eli, we're family now, aren't we?" No one answered, because no one could. Marissa slowly closed the folder without another word. Calvin looked at the frightened children waiting for someone else to decide their future. Instead, he took a deep breath, opened the front door wider, and quietly said, "Come inside." That single invitation would cost him more than he could possibly imagine. But for the first time since the accident, the 3 children walked forward together. The duplex felt even smaller once the front door closed. Calvin carried 2 folding chairs out of the garage while Eli dragged blankets from the hallway closet. By sunset, the living room had become a bedroom. The old couch unfolded for Malcolm and Eli, while Jade slept on a mattress borrowed from a neighbor. Tiana insisted on taking the floor without complaint. "I'll be fine," she said before anyone could argue. Calvin knew she wasn't. The next morning began before daylight. 5 bowls of oatmeal, 5 lunch bags, 5 jackets hanging beside a front door that had only ever held 2. Money disappeared faster than Calvin wanted to admit. He quietly pushed his own coffee aside so there would be enough milk for the children. He skipped lunch at the depot more than once, pretending he had eaten during an earlier shift. At night, after everyone was asleep, he repaired lawnmowers, bicycles, and generators in the tiny garage until midnight. He never let the children see the stack of unpaid bills tucked inside the kitchen drawer. Each child carried grief differently. Tiana spent every evening clipping newspaper articles about the crash. She folded each one carefully and hid them beneath her pillow. Whenever someone called Raymond careless or reckless on television, she silently left the room. Malcolm searched for answers inside broken machines, toasters, old radios, alarm clocks rescued from yard sales. "If I understand why things fail," he told Calvin one afternoon, "maybe I'll understand what happened to Dad." Calvin handed him a small screwdriver. "Could start by learning how to put them back together." Jade struggled with sounds. Every time a city bus hissed to a stop outside the neighborhood, she covered her ears. Thunder sent her running beneath the kitchen table. Some nights, Calvin sat on the floor beside her until sunrise, telling quiet stories while the storm passed overhead. Eli tried to be brave. Too brave. He smiled whenever Calvin looked his way. But at school, he began getting into arguments with classmates who whispered that his father cared more about those other kids. One afternoon, the principal called. Again. Walking home, Eli kicked a pebble down the sidewalk. "You don't have to keep saving everybody." Calvin looked at him. "What makes you think I am?" "You forgot Parent Day." The words landed harder than any accusation. Calvin had. He had promised Eli he would be there. Instead, he had spent the morning meeting with social services and buying winter coats from a thrift store. "I'm sorry," Calvin said quietly. Eli didn't answer for several steps. Finally, he asked, "Do you still have room to be my dad?" Calvin stopped walking. He knelt until they were eye to eye. "There isn't a person on this earth who could ever take your place." Eli nodded, but the hurt in his eyes lingered. That evening, Calvin kept another promise. He hung a handwritten note on the refrigerator. "Wednesday night belongs to Eli. No repairs, no extra jobs, no interruptions." The following Wednesday, they shared burgers at a tiny diner, while the three Cole children stayed with Marissa for 2 hours. When they returned home, Malcolm had repaired the broken kitchen clock. Its hands ticked steadily once again. Calvin smiled. "You figured it out." Malcolm shrugged. "You said every problem leaves clues." Calvin looked at the clock, then at the children filling the tiny kitchen with laughter for the first time since the funeral. For one brief evening, the little duplex felt almost whole. The knock on the front door came just after 9. Gerald Pike stood on the porch holding a leather folder. "I have a proposal," he said, "and it could solve every financial problem your family has." Gerald Pike stepped inside only after Calvin nodded. The children were already asleep. At least Calvin hoped they were. The little duplex was too small for secrets. Pike placed a leather folder on the kitchen table beside a stack of unpaid utility bills Calvin hadn't had time to hide. He looked around the room. 5 lunch bags hung beside the refrigerator. Children's drawings covered the wall. A patched winter coat rested over the back of a chair. "You've taken on quite a burden," Pike said. "They're not a burden." Pike smiled politely. "Of course." He slid a document across the table. "We're restructuring maintenance operations. Senior mechanics will be promoted." Calvin didn't touch the paper. "I'm no longer interested." "You should be." Pike leaned forward. "Salary increase. Health insurance. A housing allowance." paid college savings. He paused deliberately. For all 4 children. Calvin's eyes finally dropped to the page. The numbers were more money than he had ever imagined earning. Enough to move into a real house. Enough for Eli to have his own room again. Enough that Jade would never have to sleep on a borrowed mattress. Enough to stop repairing lawnmowers until midnight. There is one condition, Pike continued. Calvin already knew. He simply waited to hear it spoken aloud. Pike opened another folder. Inside was the official investigation into Route 46. We're finalizing the report. Calvin's jaw tightened. It concludes Raymond Cole ignored early warning signs before beginning his route. That's a lie. It is an interpretation. It never happened. Pike folded his hands calmly. If you sign as the senior mechanic familiar with the vehicle, the report becomes complete. Calvin stared at him. You want me to blame a dead man? I want the investigation finished. You denied my maintenance request. There is no approved record of such a request. There was. There isn't now. Silence settled across the kitchen. Outside, a freight train rumbled past the neighborhood. The windows trembled. Pike spoke again, his voice almost sympathetic. Think about those children. I am. They need stability. I know. They've already lost their parents. I know. If social services decides this home isn't financially secure. He left the sentence unfinished. He didn't need to finish it. Calvin understood every word. The children could be taken away, not because he didn't love them, because he couldn't afford them. Pike stood. I'll return tomorrow morning. He placed a pen beside the contract. Do what's best for your family. After the front door closed, Calvin remained motionless. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the empty room. He picked up the agreement. One signature. That was all it required. One lie. One betrayal. One dead friend who could never defend himself. Hours passed. Near midnight, Calvin walked quietly through the apartment. Jade had kicked away her blanket. He tucked it gently around her shoulders. Malcolm had fallen asleep, holding a screwdriver in one hand. Tiana still clutched another newspaper clipping beneath her pillow. Across the hall, Eli slept with the Wednesday night sign Calvin had made resting beside his bed. Calvin returned to the kitchen carrying the old blue lunchbox. He opened it slowly. Inside were tomorrow's sandwiches. Beneath them lay the folded note Melissa had once written years before. Nobody gets left at the stop. He removed the food. Then he folded Pike's agreement into a small square and placed it beneath the metal lining at the bottom of the lunchbox. Not as something to sign, as something to remember. Just before sunrise, Pike returned. Without saying a word, Calvin handed him the untouched contract. The signature line was still blank. I won't feed his children, Calvin said quietly, with a lie about their father. Pike looked at him for several long seconds. Then he closed the folder. So be it. By noon, Calvin Reed was no longer employed at Millstone Transit. Before leaving Depot 17 for the last time, he quietly opened his toolbox, removed one worn notebook, and slipped it into the blue lunchbox. Inside were every handwritten observation he had ever recorded about Route 46. Calvin never opened that notebook again. He hid it beneath the false metal lining of the lunchbox, alongside the unsigned agreement Gerald Pike had wanted him to sign. Then he closed the lid. Some truths, he believed, had to wait until they could protect people instead of destroying them. Life after Depot 17 became a careful balancing act. Every morning, Calvin searched for work before the children woke. Every afternoon, he fixed whatever people could not afford to replace. Lawnmowers, bicycles, generators, washing machines, old pickup trucks. Sometimes customers paid in cash. Sometimes they paid with groceries, firewood, or homemade soup. He accepted every job with the same quiet gratitude. The children noticed more than he realized. One evening, Eli opened the refrigerator and frowned. "Dad, where's your dinner?" "I ate earlier." He hadn't. Tiana watched him a long moment before quietly dividing her own sandwich in half. "I can't finish this." Calvin knew she was pretending. He smiled anyway. "Thank you." The following week, the electric company mailed a bright red notice. Past due. Calvin folded it before anyone else could read it, but Malcolm had already seen enough. That Saturday, the boy carried an old toolbox into the garage. "What are you doing?" Calvin asked. "Earning money." "You're 12. I can fix bicycles." "You can learn to fix bicycles." Malcolm looked disappointed. "We need the money." Calvin rested a hand on his shoulder. "We need your childhood more." Instead of sending the children to work, Calvin changed something inside the house. Every Sunday evening, he placed the old blue lunchbox in the center of the kitchen table. "This," he said, "is our repair box." Jade tilted her head. "It doesn't look broken." "It isn't. So why does it need repairs?" "Because families do." He handed everyone a stack of small note cards. "When something worries you, write it down. No names. No blaming. Just the problem." Then every Sunday, they would pull out one note together and ask a single question. "What can we fix this week?" The first card came from Jade. "I'm scared every time I hear bus brakes." Calvin didn't tell her to be brave. The next afternoon, he walked with her to the neighborhood bus stop. They sat on a bench for almost an hour. Each time a bus arrived, he quietly explained every sound. The air brakes, the engine fan, the suspension. Little by little, Jade stopped covering her ears. The second note belonged to Eli. "I miss having Dad to myself." Calvin swallowed hard. From then on, Wednesday night remained sacred. No repair jobs, no extra income, just father and son. The third note surprised everyone. It came from Malcolm. Written in careful block letters were only 7 words. "Why can machines warn us too late?" Calvin stared at the sentence for several seconds. Then he smiled gently. "They don't." 4 puzzled faces looked back at him. "They warn us all the time," he said. "Most people just don't know how to listen." That evening, he carried an old brake assembly into the garage. He tapped the metal lightly with a wrench. "Close your eyes." The children obeyed. Now tell me what you hear." "I hear tapping," Eli answered. "I hear 2 different echoes," Tiana said. Jade shrugged. "It sounds lonely." Malcolm remained silent. Finally, he whispered, "One side is vibrating." Calvin looked at him with quiet pride. Exactly. For the first time since Route 46, he opened the worn notebook hidden beneath the lunchbox. He didn't show Malcolm the pages, but he knew, as he watched the boy listen to the machine instead of simply looking at it, that something extraordinary had just begun. Neither of them realized those lessons inside a cluttered garage would one day become the foundation of a company that could save thousands of lives. The garage became their classroom. Every Saturday morning, Calvin rolled up the old metal door, letting sunlight spill across shelves crowded with discarded parts. Neighbors dropped off broken fans, worn-out bicycle brakes, old radios, and rusted lawnmowers. Most thought they were helping Calvin earn a little money. They had no idea they were also educating 4 children. Every machine tells a story, Calvin would say, laying a damaged part on the workbench. You just have to figure out which chapter you're reading. Malcolm listened with almost frightening concentration. He could identify worn bearings by sound before long. Tiana filled spiral notebooks with measurements, dates, and repair histories, organizing every detail Calvin explained. Jade surprised everyone by asking questions no one else considered. What if the driver is too scared to notice the warning? Calvin smiled. Then the warning isn't good enough. That simple sentence stayed with her. Years later, she would build user interfaces that ordinary drivers could understand in seconds. Eli contributed in his own way. He wasn't fascinated by machines like the others, but he loved helping younger neighborhood kids learn simple repairs. Calvin noticed how naturally his son encouraged people who felt left behind. "You make people believe they can learn," Calvin told him one evening. Eli shrugged. "You do that?" Life remained difficult. Winter arrived with higher heating bills. Calvin often worked until midnight repairing snowblowers while the children completed homework around the garage workbench. Sometimes the power flickered off, leaving them surrounded by candlelight. Nobody complained. One snowy afternoon, Malcolm carried an old vibration sensor home from a junkyard. "It doesn't work," he admitted. Calvin turned it over in his hands. "Good." Malcolm blinked. "Good. The broken ones teach more." Over the next several weeks, the garage transformed into a maze of wires, salvaged microphones, and homemade circuit boards. Eli borrowed an outdated laptop from school. Tiana created spreadsheets to compare sound patterns. Jade interviewed city bus drivers about the noises they noticed before mechanical failures. Their first prototype looked more like a school science project than real technology. It was held together with electrical tape and stubborn determination. The device failed repeatedly. Sometimes it shut itself off. Sometimes it beeped constantly for no reason. Sometimes it missed obvious problems altogether. Malcolm slammed a wrench onto the workbench one evening. "It's useless." Calvin calmly reset the sensor. "No, it doesn't even work." "It works perfectly." Everyone stared at him. "It just taught us 300 ways not to build the next one." Silence filled the garage. Then Tiana quietly picked up her notebook again. "Let's start over." Months later, they tested another version on an old bus axle salvaged from a scrapyard. Calvin loosened one worn component by less than a fraction of an inch. The sensor immediately detected a vibration pattern. No dashboard warning light appeared. No computer fault code was generated. But their homemade device heard the danger. Malcolm's eyes widened. "It found it." Calvin nodded. "Long before anyone would have noticed." Tiana looked from the sensor to the old notebook Calvin rarely opened. "This is the same pattern." She stopped herself. Calvin quietly closed the notebook. Some things belong in the past. He wasn't ready to tell them everything. Not yet. Years passed. Science fairs became engineering competitions. Scholarships replaced hand-me-down dreams. One afternoon, Tiana burst through the front door, holding a university acceptance letter in trembling hands. A transportation engineering professor had read her research on overlooked mechanical warning patterns. His final sentence made the entire family fall silent. "This idea," he wrote, "has the potential to change public transportation safety across America." Calvin folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the blue lunchbox. Then he looked at the 4 young people gathered around the kitchen table. "I want you to promise me something." They all nodded. "If this ever becomes something important," he paused, choosing each word with care, So never build a future by selling the worst day of your parents' lives. The room fell completely still. One by one, they gave him their word. None of them realized that promise would become far more difficult to keep than building the company itself. Years slipped by, not all at once, but in quiet moments that slowly reshaped every life under Calvin's roof. The little duplex eventually became too small for their dreams. Tiana left first, earning a scholarship to study transportation systems. Malcolm followed with an engineering grant after winning a national innovation competition using a prototype that traced hidden vibration patterns inside aging transit vehicles. Jade chose industrial design, determined to make complicated safety systems simple enough for ordinary people to trust. Before each child left Millstone, Calvin handed them the same blue lunchbox. Not to keep, only to carry for the trip. Each time they returned it before leaving campus again, he quietly placed it back on the kitchen shelf. "It belongs here," he always said. North Star Transit Systems didn't appear overnight. The first investors laughed at Malcolm's presentation. "You expect cities to buy a system that hears problems before computers do?" The second group rejected them because they were too young. The third believed they were solving a problem that didn't exist. They nearly ran out of money twice. Tiana worked evenings reviewing transportation regulations for a law firm just to keep the company alive. Malcolm slept on a folding cot inside their tiny office. Jade designed software interfaces during the day and delivered groceries after sunset. Whenever things became overwhelming, one of them called Calvin. His advice never changed. Fix the next problem. Not the whole future. Just the next problem. Everything changed after a transit agency in Colorado agreed to test their newest monitoring system. Late one winter night, North Star detected an abnormal vibration pattern inside the battery cooling system of an electric bus fleet. Maintenance crews inspected the vehicles. Several components were replaced before any failure occurred. The agency later reported that a potentially dangerous incident had been avoided. News spread quickly. Cities across the country began calling. Within 5 years, North Star protected thousands of buses, commuter trains, and municipal fleets. The company grew beyond anything the four children had imagined. Magazines called them visionary founders. Business journals celebrated their billion-dollar valuation. Television hosts praised their innovation. None of those interviews mentioned the cluttered garage in Millstone or the mechanic who had first taught them to listen. Calvin never seemed interested in the headlines. After losing Depot 17, he rented an abandoned warehouse nearby and turned it into a free evening workshop. Teenagers who struggled in school learned to repair bicycles, lawn equipment, and small engines. Veterans rebuilding their lives worked beside recent high school graduates. Every broken machine became another lesson in patience. Eli stayed in Millstone after college. Rather than joining North Star, he became a vocational instructor at the local technical school. When reporters once asked why he hadn't followed his siblings into business, he smiled. "Dad taught us to fix what our community actually needs." Calvin was proud of every one of them, but he still kept certain things hidden. The occasional pain in his chest, the overdue property taxes on the workshop, the notices from City Hall announcing that Depot 17, the place where everything had begun, would soon be sold to a private developer. He folded every letter before anyone else could see it. One afternoon, while organizing old training manuals, Calvin suddenly paused, gripping the edge of a workbench until the dizziness passed. A student hurried over. "You okay, Mr. Reed?" Calvin forced a smile. "Just stood up too fast." He never mentioned the doctor's recommendation to slow down, or the medication he often forgot to refill because someone else always needed something more urgently. Then, 3 weeks before the scheduled auction, the local council held a public meeting. Gerald Pike stood before the microphone, older now, but no less confident. "The old depot represents a painful chapter in this town's history," he announced. "It's time to move forward." Then he spoke the name Calvin had spent 15 years protecting. Raymond Cole. Every conversation in the room stopped. Within minutes, someone had clipped Pike's remarks and posted them online. Hundreds of miles away, Tiana watched the video in stunned silence. She reached for her phone. There was already a message waiting from Calvin. Only 6 words. "They're using your father's name again." Tiana canceled her meetings before the video had even finished playing. Across the country, Malcolm was halfway through a product demonstration when his phone vibrated. He read Calvin's message once, closed his laptop, and quietly apologized to the audience. "I have to go home." Jade never replied to the text. She simply booked the first available flight to Millstone. Less than 36 hours later, the 3 of them stood together outside the city limits for the first time in years. Nothing about Millstone had changed. The old grain elevator still overlooked the river. The railroad crossing still delayed traffic every afternoon. Even the faded diner where Calvin used to buy Wednesday night burgers with Eli still served pie in the same cracked display case. Only Depot 17 looked different. A chain-link fence surrounded the property, and bright orange signs announced the city's upcoming auction. Calvin was inside the workshop next door, repairing an old bicycle for a neighborhood boy. He looked up only after hearing familiar footsteps. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then Jade crossed the room and hugged him so tightly that the wrench slipped from his hand. "You've lost weight," she whispered. "I'm getting older." "No." She looked directly into his eyes. You're hiding something." Calvin smiled the way he always did whenever someone worried about him. "I'm still harder to fix than any machine." By evening, the family gathered around the same scarred kitchen table where the repair box had once sat every Sunday. Eli poured coffee. Tiana spread printed copies of the city proposal across the table. "They're selling Depot 17 in 3 days." "I know. We can stop it." Calvin slowly shook his head. "You don't buy history." "We're not buying history," Malcolm replied. "We're protecting it." "No." Calvin's voice remained calm but firm. "If North Star buys that property now, people will say everything we built came from money." "It did come from us," Jade answered softly. "It came from you." Calvin looked away. "That's exactly what I'm trying to prevent." The room fell quiet. Finally, Tiana spoke. "Dad, why did you never tell us everything?" Calvin stood without answering. He walked to the old kitchen cabinet and carefully removed the dented blue lunchbox from the highest shelf. Its paint had faded even more over the years. The handle rattled slightly as he placed it on the table. "I hoped you'd never need this." He pressed a small screwdriver beneath the inside edge. With a gentle click, the false metal lining lifted free. Malcolm stopped breathing. Inside rested a folded agreement, yellowed with age. Beneath it lay Calvin's handwritten notebook. Every page was filled with dates, sketches, vibration patterns, brake measurements, and observations from Route 46. Tiana unfolded the agreement. Her hands trembled. "This..." She looked up. "They asked you to sign this?" Calvin nodded once. "They wanted Raymond blamed. And you refused. I couldn't let your father carry a lie after he was gone." Silence settled over the room. Malcolm opened the notebook. His eyes moved rapidly across the familiar diagrams. I know these numbers. He flipped another page. And these frequencies. Another page. The pattern recognition model. His voice faded. Jade leaned closer. What is it? Malcolm slowly looked at his sisters. The first algorithm I ever wrote. He swallowed hard. Came from this notebook. Tiana stared at Calvin. Our entire detection system started here, Malcolm finished quietly. No, Calvin corrected. It started the day your father trusted me enough to listen. Tiana closed the notebook carefully. For 15 years, you let the world believe you were just an old mechanic. Calvin smiled. That's because I was. She reached across the table and took his weathered hand. No. Her eyes filled with tears. You were the first engineer North Star ever had. Outside, the lights of Depot 17 glowed beyond the kitchen window. Inside, the truth that Calvin had hidden beneath the lunchbox for 15 years finally belonged to all 4 of his children. And for the first time, Tiana knew exactly why her father had looked afraid when she placed that lunchbox in front of him at the auction. He hadn't been afraid of the memories. He had been afraid of what the truth might make them do. The auction began the following morning beneath a gray September sky. Nearly the entire town gathered outside Depot 17. Developers saw valuable land. Former transit workers saw a forgotten building. Reporters saw another story about a successful billion-dollar company returning to its hometown. Only the Reed family saw the place where 4 lives had begun again. Calvin arrived quietly in his old pickup truck. He wore the same faded work jacket he had owned for years. The dented blue lunchbox rested on the passenger seat. Across the street, Gerald Pike adjusted his tie before greeting city officials with practiced confidence. When he noticed Calvin, he offered a polite smile. I didn't expect to see you. I never really left. Pike chuckled softly. I suppose sentiment has its place. Before Calvin could answer, 3 black SUVs rolled onto the property. The crowd immediately turned. Tiana stepped out first. Malcolm followed, then Jade. Television cameras rushed toward them. Ms. Cole, is North Star purchasing Depot 17 today? Will this become your new headquarters? Are you expanding operations back into Millstone? Tiana paused at the microphone. We're here because of family. Nothing more. Nothing less. The auctioneer called everyone to order. Bidding opened quickly. A regional developer offered the minimum price. Another company raised it. The numbers climbed steadily. Then Tiana lifted her bidding paddle. North Star entered the auction. Within minutes, every competing bidder withdrew. The auctioneer struck the gavel. Sold. Applause echoed across the lot. Reporters rushed forward again. Ms. Cole, what are your plans for the property? Tiana looked toward Calvin before speaking. We're not building offices. Confused murmurs spread through the crowd. We're restoring Depot 17 exactly where it stands. She turned toward the old maintenance building. This place taught 4 frightened children that kindness can change an entire future. Malcolm stepped beside her. We're converting the depot into a free transportation safety and skilled trades training center. Jade continued. It will welcome veterans, single parents, young mechanics, high school students, and anyone who simply needs another chance. A reporter raised his hand. What's it going to be called? The 3 siblings looked at Calvin. He slowly shook his head, as if asking them not to. Tiana smiled anyway. The Open Route Skills Center. Calvin lowered his eyes. He knew exactly why they had chosen that name. Another reporter shouted from the back. Is it true your company began with the research inside that notebook? The crowd fell silent. Every camera turned toward Calvin. He stepped to the microphone for what felt like the first time in his life. No. People leaned closer. It began with a promise. He opened the blue lunchbox. Instead of displaying the notebook, he removed only one small folded piece of paper. Melissa's handwritten note. Its edges had faded with time. He unfolded it carefully. My wife wrote this years before any of us imagined what would happen. His voice remained steady. It became the rule we tried to live by. He looked toward Tiana, Malcolm, Jade, and Eli, then out across the crowd. Finally, he read the words aloud. Nobody gets left at the stop. For several seconds, no one moved. Even the reporters lowered their cameras. Gerald Pike quietly removed his glasses. His shoulders seemed smaller than anyone remembered. He walked toward Calvin without speaking. I destroyed your career, he admitted. I thought protecting the company mattered more than protecting the truth. Calvin looked at him for a long moment. You can't repair yesterday. Pike nodded. No. But perhaps I can help tomorrow. He removed an envelope from his briefcase. Inside was a notarized statement. A full confession describing how maintenance records had been altered after the Route 46 crash. I should have done this 15 years ago. Calvin accepted the envelope, not with triumph, simply with relief. Some burdens had finally found their proper owner. As sunlight broke through the clouds above Depot 17, the old building no longer looked abandoned. For the first time in many years, it looked like a beginning. Construction crews arrived the following week, but before a single wall was painted or a single beam replaced, Calvin made one request. Leave the old maintenance bay exactly as it is. The workers looked puzzled. Its concrete floor was cracked. The workbenches were scarred by decades of use. Rust stained the old tool cabinets. To everyone else, it looked worn out. To Calvin, it looked honest. Months later, the grand opening of the Open Route Skills Center drew people from across the state. Former mechanics stood beside college professors. City officials shook hands with teenagers carrying toolboxes. Single parents toured classrooms where tuition would never be charged. Above the entrance hung a simple bronze plaque, not with the names of billionaires, not with the logo of North Star. Only one sentence was engraved: nobody gets left at the stop. Visitors naturally assumed it was the center's slogan. Only 5 people knew it had once been a handwritten note folded inside a dented blue lunchbox. Inside the restored maintenance bay, Calvin taught the very first class himself. A dozen students gathered around an aging bus axle mounted on a training stand. Some had engineering degrees. Others had never held a wrench before. Calvin tapped the metal gently. "What do you hear?" The room stayed quiet. One young woman finally answered. "I don't know." Calvin smiled. "Good." Several students looked confused. "The day you think you already know everything." He rested his hand on the axle. "Is the day you'll stop listening." The lesson had never really been about machines. It had always been about people. After class, Malcolm walked through the garage alone. He paused beside the original workbench from Calvin's old shop. Every dent seemed familiar. Every scratch carried a memory. He quietly placed the first production model of North Star's vibration sensor on the bench. It fit perfectly beside Calvin's worn hammer. Past and future, resting together. Outside, children laughed as they learned to repair bicycles. Veterans mentored high school students. Parents who had once believed their lives were over discovered new careers. The old depot was alive again. Late that afternoon, Tiana found Calvin sitting alone on the loading dock, watching the sunset wash warm light across the railroad tracks. "You've been smiling all day," she said. "I have." "What are you thinking about?" Calvin looked toward the center. "I'm thinking that your father would have loved this place." Tiana sat beside him. "So would Mom." For a while, neither of them spoke. The evening breeze carried the distant sound of a city bus slowing for a stop. Years earlier, that sound had filled Jade with fear. Today, it simply sounded like another family making it safely home. Tiana reached into her bag. "I almost forgot." She handed Calvin the old blue lunchbox. He laughed softly. "I wondered who had stolen it." "I think it belongs to you." Calvin turned it over in his hands. The faded paint, the loose handle, the tiny scratches collected over decades. It had once carried sandwiches, then secrets, then hope. Now it carried something even greater. Proof that kindness, when practiced every day, could outlive tragedy. Without opening it, Calvin handed the lunchbox back. "No." Tiana looked surprised. "It's yours now." She shook her head. "It was always yours." Calvin smiled. "It never belonged to me." He looked toward the students walking through the front doors. "It belongs to whoever needs a second chance next." Years later, visitors would ask why one battered blue lunchbox sat inside a glass display case near the entrance. The plaque beneath it never mentioned billion-dollar companies. It never listed awards. It never described inventions. It simply read, "A father kept his promise. 4 children kept his values. And because they chose kindness over bitterness, thousands of families arrived home safely, long after the speeches ended, long after the cameras disappeared, and long after the headlines had been forgotten." The old depot continued doing exactly what Calvin Reid had always believed people should do. Listen carefully. Repair what is broken, and never leave anyone behind at the stop. When Calvin Reid placed that battered blue lunchbox into the hands of the next generation instead of keeping it for himself, he proved that the greatest legacy isn't something you own. It's something you pass on. That quiet moment said more than any headline ever could. This story reminds us that some of the most powerful gifts are given without expecting recognition. Calvin never fought to have his name remembered. He simply chose to do the right thing, and that choice shaped lives far beyond his own. Today, think of one small piece of your own life you can pass forward. Share a skill, encourage someone who's struggling, or simply give another person the time and patience Calvin gave every child who walked through his garage. You may never know how far that single act will travel. If Calvin's story stayed with you, leave a 1 in the comments. I'd also love to know, what's one lesson someone quietly passed on to you that still guides your life today? And if this journey touched your heart, stay with us. Because the next story begins with another ordinary moment that changes everything.